Our first reading today is from an essay in the winter 2018 edition of the African American Review, titled Identifying White Mediocrity and Know Your Place Aggression, a Form of Self-Care, by Dr. Coretha Mitchell. She writes, by voting for Donald Trump, 63 million Americans communicated their belief that successful people of color, especially women, had forgotten their proper place. Trump's election and the hate crimes that attended it reiterated what was already painfully clear. The United States remains committed to its tradition of know your place aggression. I define know your place aggression as the flexible, dynamic array of forces that answer the achievements of marginalized groups such that their success brings aggression as often as praise. Any progress by those who are not straight, white, and male is answered by a backlash of violence, both literal and symbolic, both physical and discursive, that essentially says, know your place. It is important to identify this tradition because cultural critics should help the nation remain clear about what did and did not fuel the election of this far less than mediocre man. Voters were primed for Trump, but not because people of color failed to organize enough or in the right way. It was not because the Obama years emboldened people of color and made them so aggressive in their demands that their behavior sparked white resentment. After all, to rally around hashtag Black Lives Matter is simply to say, we'd like to not be killed in cold blood and with impunity, please. Targeted communities and their allies must understand that the country did not arrive at this political, social, and moral juncture because people of color and other marginalized groups did something wrong, but rather because they were succeeding at claiming space as citizens, not as privileged citizens, but simply as people who believe they belong. For anyone other than a straight white man, success often inspires aggression, and the accomplishment need not be monumental or spectacular to inspire large-scale and extremely hostile backlash. It is because Black communities have so consistently achieved that white-authored violence has constantly emerged to check their progress. Violence pursues marginalized groups because they accumulate achievements, and American culture is designed to remind everyone that accomplishment is meant for straight white men. Because know your place aggression shapes outcomes for all Americans, both those who are put in their proper place and those whose success is supported, these patterns should not remain unmarked in public conversations. Marginalized groups and their allies need to be equipped with language that helps them to resist absorbing dominant assumptions that are designed to silence and shame them. They need to know that aggression comes their way because they are successful, not because they've done something wrong. Only when empowered to refuse shame can individuals maintain the energy needed to address the racism, sexism, heterosexism, trans antagonism, xenophobia, Islamophobia, and ableism that have only intensified with Trump's political ascendancy. Marginalization is a violent process that takes no breaks, and it has everything to do with how consistently marginalized groups succeed and, in fact, epitomize all that the nation claims to respect. Basically, because marginalized groups are constantly overcoming obstacles, they are putting the purported model citizen, the straight white man, to shame. And so American culture wants these groups to believe that the shame belongs to them. It doesn't. Here ends the first reading. Our second reading is Wild Geese by Mary Oliver. You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese, high in the clean blue air, are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over announcing your place in the family of things. Here end today's readings. It's been a tumultuous last few years for all of us, with everything that's been going on in the world. With the pandemic bottling us all up and increasing health risks, looming economic and financial uncertainties, and the escalating political tensions and divisions, I suppose it could have been expected that as it was all crashing together, something was going to give. And so it did. While reenacting history last year with both a global pandemic and the beginnings of the Great Depression, we got a trifecta with the unrest of the peak of the civil rights movement to top it all off. With all of that pressure, it was only a matter of time before fear and anger would ignite in a way that ended in the death of an innocent Black man. And towards the end of May 2020, that man was George Floyd. I spent the early months of the pandemic commuting back and forth between my home in St. Paul, Minnesota, and my dad's house in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, about 5 hours east. I would carefully plot my route and gauge my needs so that I would have as little contact with the world between the two places as possible, because in those days we weren't entirely sure how COVID spread, so everything was suspect, from gas pumps to grocery deliveries. As I returned to Wisconsin on one of those trips, I learned about the murder of George Floyd at the hands of Minneapolis police officers. From the idyllic comfort of rural suburbia, I watched reports rolling in from my friends online of protests, of police escalating violence against neighborhoods and citizens they were sworn to serve and protect. I watched places I'd visited with friends on sunny afternoons get set on fire. I watched my city burn, and I watched the National Guard fire guns into neighborhoods, and I watched my friends respond, and I paced my guest room in Wisconsin feeling powerless to help. And I wondered, what can I do? How can I help? What is my place in all of this? That is at the heart a theological and ultimately human question. What is my place in the family of things? We spend perhaps our whole lives wrestling with possible answers, with the very real possibility that we will never know for sure. What does it mean to know your place? I'd like to explore two answers to that question today. The first echoes back to our Mary Oliver poem, coming from the perspective of self-awareness and personal identity, and frankly, white privilege. The second echoes our reading from Dr. Coretha Mitchell and explores a historic and current perspective of how that phrase, know your place, has been used as violence against marginalized communities. Reverend Vanessa Rush Southern writes, "The longer I live, the harder it seems to be to know myself. I've given up completely knowing others or being sure I know them. Just when I think I have someone's number, that person is sure to completely surprise me. It's part of what makes us human beings interesting. There's nothing better than a complicated person whose motives change and rub up against each other." She continues, "I rewatched Schindler's List the other night. Now there is a complicated person. Oskar Schindler, opportunistic, a spy, bon vivant, choosing to sacrifice his wealth, and risk his well-being to save 1,200 Jewish people from the Nazis. I wonder if he surprised even himself. History is full of complicated people, and so are our own homes and hearts, which is why it's so hard to know ourselves, to know our place and role in the world, she concludes. Nearly 3,000 years ago, around 800 BC in ancient Greece, people hungry for answers to that question would consult the oracle at Delphi, hoping that the priestess, the Pythia, would reveal those secrets and help them unravel that mysterious question, seeking definition and direction to the question of their place in the world. However, the oracle never gave straight answers. She gave truthful ones, perhaps, but as with most things of great import, it was always open to interpretation. The success of the seeker was largely dependent on how well they adhered to the Delphic maxim that was carved into the Pythia's entryway. The lintel above the doorway was carved with the words, "Know thyself." Those who received her wisdom from the grounding of their own self-knowledge were generally able to proceed wisely. And those who received her words through the lens of their own ego or ambition tended to hear what they wanted to hear, and they followed their fate to disaster. Delphic wisdom would encourage people to be appropriately humble, to have an engaged awareness of one's place and power in the world, and to behave in ways that were a match, to act the right size, so to speak. It is certainly hubris to act too large, but it is equally destructive for us to act smaller than we actually are, to shrink down and give away our power. We often misinterpret our oracles when we seek guidance without self-knowledge, and we can get ourselves into trouble when we take action without first assessing our own social location. It was with that in mind that I returned to Minnesota as the fires began to die down. The streets were still full of rubble. Small businesses owned by marginalized families were burned to the ground right along with large chain stores. Rumors abounded about who set the fires and why, but in the immediate aftermath, it didn't make a difference in what needed to be done. The community was turning out by the thousands to reclaim their streets and find ways to make it beautiful again, perhaps even more beautiful than it was before, bright with artwork covering up the boarded up buildings. But here I was, a white, educated, straight, cisgender woman on the cusp of middle age. I'd seen enough memes floating around the internet about my demographic to know that if I wanted to be of service to these communities in this moment, I needed to act with care. What is my place? I certainly knew enough not to go charging in like a white savior, and I wanted my assistance to be more relational and meaningful than a momentary liberal photo op. I did not want to be a tourist or a spectator. And I also didn't want to just wring my hands, furrowing my brow and offering thoughts and prayers. What use could I be? Where was my place in all of this? Lacking an oracle to direct me, I turned to Facebook. After poring through posts from various activist organizations, I found what I was looking for. Support crew needed for Black organizers at 38th and Chicago. That was the intersection where George Floyd was killed outside the corner store. So I called the number listed and I asked if my partner Jacob and I could be of assistance that day. After a quick but warm conversation, for that day at least I knew my place, amplifying Black voices and supporting Black leadership. But as we heard in our first reading, know your place has a very different connotation for Black people and for all marginalized communities. Dr. Coretha Mitchell defines know your place aggression as the flexible, dynamic array of forces that answer the achievements of marginalized groups such that their success brings aggression as often as praise. Any progress by those who are not straight, white, and male is answered by a backlash of violence, she writes, both literal and symbolic, both physical and discursive, that essentially says, know your place. We've been witnessing the truth of this for a long time now. That is part of why it is so important that people with privilege, particularly white folks, actively seek to support Black successes, Black voices, and ultimately Black power. Historically and currently, the Black community has been punished for every success. The implicit message, and often explicit message, that they had risen above their station. They got uppity. They forgot their place. The punishment, often violent and meted out by whites, was a punitive act meant to reinforce the message. Know your place, and know that it is at the very bottom of society. We see historical evidence of this punishment for Black success everywhere once we start looking for it. Some of the most prominent examples include the Tulsa Massacre of 1921, 100 years ago, when white mobs destroyed the most affluent Black neighborhood in the country. It was called Black Wall Street. Or we can look to Jacksonville, Florida, where 60 years ago, Black students were chased through the streets by the Klan with axe handles and batons for having the audacity to think they could share the lunch counter with whites in an event that became known as Axe Handle Saturday. We can look to Bloody Sunday and the Edmund Pettus Bridge down in Selma, Alabama. And we can look to 2008, when a Black man forgot his place and dared to get himself elected to the highest office in the land. And we can look to the way our Black First Lady was called uppity for encouraging healthy eating and saying she enjoyed arugula. We can look to the unprecedented obstructionism that marked their terms in office and the violently racist backlash that ensued once that presidency ended. This is why it is countercultural and often perceived as threatening when we declare that Black lives matter. In our country and in our culture, it is no simple statement. So part of my purpose here, as I juxtaposed in our two readings, is to wrestle with these two realities, these two experiences of a simple but powerful phrase, know your place. And I wonder if we might hold both the historic and ongoing violence and the hopeful promise of community and belonging that are both held within those words. We are at a moment where we see the specters of fascism and white nationalism, not in some unfortunate country overseas, but taking root on the main stage in our own democratic republic, hateful rhetoric coming from the mouths of our elected leaders. We still struggle with the reality that a significant percentage of our population has chosen to embrace willful ignorance, even an intentional negligence of science, logic, and reason. Things that we hold up as ideals in Unitarian Universalism. We witness gross desecration of the earth for capital gain, which runs against our own commitments as green sanctuaries who respect the interdependent world we share with all creatures. In the lead up to the 2020 elections, which were really only a year ago, the former administration was intentionally choosing sites that are famous for violence against marginalized people for their important events. The first pandemic rally in Tulsa, Oklahoma, was originally scheduled for Juneteenth, before public outcry made them shift it by a day. Trump celebrated 4th of July last year at Mount Rushmore, a model of white supremacy dominating Native Holy Lands. For his opening song, he chose to play the song that Custer would use before a mass hanging of Native people. Trump insisted on moving the Republican convention from Charlotte, North Carolina to Jacksonville, Florida, where he planned to accept his nomination on the 60th anniversary of Axe Handle Saturday. However, again, after outcry, he moved it back to Charlotte, citing Florida's coronavirus risk as his reason, after he had spent weeks pushing Florida to reopen their economy. In spite of the relief of a new administration, we've also seen the most massive voter suppression effort in history, from the Postmaster General systematically dismantling the US Postal Service after his appointment last July, right on the eve of a presidential election during a pandemic that caused record numbers of voters to trust their ballots to the mail, all the way to a bombardment of legislation passing in various states that restrict people's ability to cast their votes freely. The message from all of this is clear: know your place. But what if we, marginalized communities and allies together, what if we collectively said, no, that isn't our place in the family of things? What if we all refused to accept the shame that is being forced upon us? As Unitarian Universalists, we have a commitment to justice, compassion, and equity in human relations. And as we continue as a denomination to empower Black voices and support Black lives and declare that their success and their thriving matter, we realize that our faith commitment also extends to dismantling these systems of oppression that divide us from each other and prevent us from realizing the beloved community to which we aspire. Back in Minneapolis, at the intersection of 38th and Chicago, outside that little corner store, for a block or more in every direction, those city streets became sacred ground, covered in flowers and artwork and memorials. My partner and I showed up that day and asked the Black organizers how we could help. Anything, we offered. We will do anything you need us to do so that you can be successful and your voices can be heard. And the woman in charge, who identified herself as Mama Moses, turned to us and gently asked us to wander the streets picking up trash in the 90-degree heat. I don't want them to say we don't run a tight ship, she said. I don't want this neighborhood looking worse for us being here. So that's what we did. And we came back the next day and the next. Eyes on the ground amidst the crowds, we picked up the garbage that had been left behind by those who didn't clean up after themselves. How fitting, I thought, for this to be the work of white people. Know your place, indeed. So may we all know our place on the side of love, compassion, and integrity, binding one another's wounds again and again, cleaning up the messes that were left behind, so that we can go on, fully empowered and unashamed, together. May it be so, and amen.